Lundy Bancroft is the former co-director of Emerge, which was the first counseling program in the United States for men who batter. He served as a custody evaluator, child abuse investigator, and expert witness. He's authored a number of books, including Why Does He Do That? And The Batterer as Parent. If you haven't read them, I really recommend them. They're foundational to everything I do in this job. My whole understanding of domestic violence. So I'm very grateful, thank you. And his work focuses on justice for adult and child victims and survivors of domestic violence. He was one of the first people to move the spotlight from victims and focus it on the behavior of men who batter and the ways that they entrap women in relationships.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody. So let me tell you a little bit more about my background. So as you heard, I came into domestic violence work on the offender end, and the lion's share of my direct service work has been with the abusers. And so you'll see how much that shapes my perspective, because when people think of domestic violence, they tend to immediately picture an abused woman, and she's certainly always there in my thoughts. But what tends to be most central in my thoughts is a guy who's doing a lot of damage. And I really believe that it's important for us to keep our eye on who is the agent of the violence. And I've always been concerned over the years when I hear people say things like, there's domestic violence in that home, the way you would say there's asbestos in the basement. And the domestic violence is not in the home. The domestic violence is in the perpetrator of domestic violence. And it's important that awareness not slip away. And in fact, when it does slip away, I feel like well-intentioned people start to make certain kinds of mistakes. And which leads to another thing that I always like to say from the very beginning, which is that fairly commonly in people's reactions to hearing about that I'm going to be presenting somewhere, for them to say, well, I don't work with offenders, I'm not interested in working with offenders, I don't ever intend to work with offenders, so why do I need to know this stuff? And my response to that is that I believe how we respond and how we attempt to assist women and children is largely rooted in what our understanding is about what the abuser is like. And that means that misunderstandings that we have about what the abuser is like can lead us to make mistakes. Again, well-intentioned mistakes. But some of the worst advice that I hear people give abused women is, I realize, is coming from misunderstandings about what a domestic abuser is all about. And that often has to do with situations where it's a mom with kids, which leads to the next thing I'll say about my own background. So I led groups for abusers for years, tons of groups. I worked with over 1,000 abusers directly and supervised about another 1,000 cases. And so many different styles of guy, like every different kind of personality type, every different level of education, every different racial and ethnic group in the US and 20 foreign countries. I'm Spanish speaking, so I led our Spanish speaking groups for years. And yes, each abuser is a unique individual, but their similarities are much more striking than their differences are. And when you're leading groups, it's remarkable how sometimes you will see two guys that are about as different could be, that can entirely connect as soon as they're starting to talk about women and as soon as they're starting to talk about their excuses for abusing women. And you just see this eye contact and this level of kind of disturbing understanding happening between guys that are so very different. Oh, by the way, I also came into the field with almost pure misconceptions about what the domestic batterer was like. And it was not easy to shake me loose from a lot of my early beliefs. But it just became inescapable because I would run into, and you'll hear a bunch of my stories today, I would keep running into situations where it's like, this is real life, I'm gonna have to let go of what the notions were that I came in with. So next is that one of my early supervisors, who was a formerly abused woman herself and who had a child, was trying very hard to wake me up and wake the rest of our staff up at Emerge to the fact that these guys were doing a lot of damage to kids, that they were really grinding kids up psychologically in a bunch of different ways. And it took her a while to get through to us. I think we, with a lot of other people in the field, had the early sense of like, well, that's got to be somebody else's terrain. You know, I'm here to deal with the offender. I can't deal with the children. And again, a bunch of misconceptions that we were carrying about what we needed to be talking to him about and how he was bringing that harm about. But eventually, under her pressure, we started to become much more child-oriented in our program, start talking to guys in different ways, start raising children's issues way more in the group, and mostly just starting to have a deeper understanding of how much these guys are drawing the children into the fabric of how they're abusing the woman and the ways that that's grinding the kids up psychologically. We also started to notice I would say by the mid-1990s, we started to notice a lot, because I go back to the mid-80s, that we started to notice our guys playing the custody card a lot. And I had a fairly early experience of one of my clients who had always said to me, always said to his group, how little interest he had in the kids, how children weren't his thing, how that was something she was into, and he hadn't even really wanted to have children. And then suddenly, while he's in our group, we find out, not from him, but we find out from our contacts with the victim, that he had filed for custody. So then we started to understand, oh, this isn't about their concern for the kids. This is just another weapon in their arsenal. And what led me actually to write my first book, which was The Batterer as Parent, was that I started to realize how much damage these guys were doing to mother-child relationships. I started to realize that was one of the ways that they were doing the greatest harm in the home, was the ways that they were turning moms and kids against each other, causing tensions, setting them against each other in all different kinds of ways, or just keeping them apart. I will say about The Batterer as Parent, I appreciated the plug for it this morning, but it's an absurdly expensive book. So get your agency to buy it, or get it at the library. But the other thing I should say about The Batterer as Parent is that it has very little advice about what to do except for judges and attorneys and custody evaluators, like people who are in the family law system. And so it's a lot of analysis of what goes wrong and very little advice about what to do about it. So I have a book that's way cheaper, because it's a regular trade book instead of a textbook, called When Dad Hurts Mom, that covers not all the legal points that the first book does, but it covers really all the essential points, but actually gives suggestions. That book is written to mom, like you, mom is the you in that book, but I had very, very much, I had child welfare workers and therapists and everybody else in mind as I wrote that. And almost every chapter ends with a what can you do section, because I wasn't finding anything out there. I hope this has improved in the years since, but I wasn't finding anything out there that actually assumed that moms were allies in this struggle and that actually talked to them about what they can be trying. So a couple points that'll sort of underline what I talk about all day. One is tremendous number of misconceptions to what abusers are all about. And I think the most common one that I run into is the idea that he's kind of more or less like anybody else. He's more or less like a non-abusive man, except that he builds up too much inside of himself and explodes. What at Emerge we used to call the boiler theory of men, that the pressure isn't getting vented enough so it goes kaboom. And I was told this wasn't true when I came into the work, but it took me a while to let go of it. But I was forced to realize how much method there is to the madness, that we are not talking about explosiveness. So many of the horrible things he does while not even angry. So many of them are calculated. And even the things that he does when he's angry are following tremendous awareness. I have so few experiences with these couple thousand cases that I've been in of guys doing things that really were not what they intended to do. And so the abuser is different from the non-abusive man all the time. His entire orientation towards a relationship, and I'm going to be talking about what that is completely different. So the notion that somehow we could get something to change by addressing the explosiveness is just false. It goes nowhere. And so that's why those of us in the field for decades have been saying, don't send abusers to anger management programs. Well, as someone just told me a year ago, an audience member just told me a year ago, and I wish this had been said to me so perfectly 30 years earlier, abusers are already great at managing their anger. That's one of their specialties. So it makes no sense to send him to a course to teach him even more strategies for managing his anger. And the other thing, another one of my sort of catchphrases is, he's not abusive because he's angry because he's abusive. And I'm going to take you through some of the key belief system elements, key attitudes that abusers have, so you'll see that anyone who's carrying that set of attitudes, what I would say anyone who's carrying the essential equipment that makes him an abuser of women, is going to be angry. You can't carry that set of attitudes and not often be pissed off. But again, as I will underline, so many of the things he does have nothing to do with being angry. When she says that she's gone to the supermarket and home during the day, and he has previously measured the distance to the supermarket and back so that he knows exactly what it is, and goes out and checks the odometer on the car to make sure that that's exactly what she did, what's that got to do with anger or explosiveness? Zip. So in the Batterer intervention field, we talk about we say that this behavior is not irrational, it's instrumental. In other words, rather than being some kind of explosion, his abusiveness is an instrument that he's using to get things that he wants, and that actually works pretty well. And it's another thing I like to caution people about, is about thinking about this as dysfunctional behavior, because it actually functions quite well for him. Incredibly destructive to women and children. But one of the great differences between a domestic abuser and, for example, someone who's struggling with addiction is that someone who's struggling with addiction may be doing quite a bit of harm to other people. They sometimes are, but they're also doing harm to themselves. And over time, someone with addiction, we're starting to see some effects on that person's work and professional life and how they perform in that. We're starting to see some effects on their relationships. Many people are starting to think badly about them, and they're starting to mostly hang out with other addicts. And even if they're addicted to a high-class drug like cocaine, you still start to see these same things happening to them. It starts to affect their physical health and so forth. And there's this expression in the addiction world about hitting bottom, how sometimes this just spirals down so much that they hit a point where they can't function, and sometimes that's what leads them to finally get to help. The domestic abuser does not hit bottom. He can abuse for 20 or 30 years, and we don't see any noticeable change in his physical health. We don't see any noticeable change in how his career or work is going. We don't see any change in his popularity in town, who his friends are. Most of these guys, including some of the worst, are quite successful at making this invisible to everybody else. So then the other point that I really like to say always from the very beginning, so that it's kind of underlying there as we talk, and this is specifically about the woman with kids, about the abused mother. There are no simple answers in the life of an abused mom. And the society is very fond of saying to her, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you do this other thing? The most common one being, well, you should leave him. And almost no one follows up to see, well, what happens if she does these recommended things and how well do they work? But I will tell you now, no strategy that she uses if she's got children works reliably. She has to try as many different things as she can think of to try and see what might work and what might not. Some women, I hate to say it, but some moms do everything exactly what we would wish she would do, and things go disastrously for reasons that I'll be explaining some, no fault of hers. Largely have to do with the custody courts, actually, which you will get an earful about from me today, because they've become, in some ways, the top national enabler of child abuse and violence against women. I hear some I hear some resonating. There's this really widespread myth that if she would just leave the abuser, conditions would necessarily and automatically improve for her children. And therefore, if she doesn't leave the abuser, she's letting her children down. And she gets labeled things like guilty of failure to protect, very common in child welfare services. Or people will say things about her like she's choosing him over them, and not aware of where things actually go. Not aware of the cases where she leaves him and gets killed. Not aware of the cases where she leaves him and one or more of the children get killed. And particularly not aware of cases where she leaves him and he ends up with shared or even primary custody of those kids. And that situation, I hate to say it, but it's still getting worse. I felt like 20 years ago, how much worse can it get? It turns out it can get a lot worse than it was 20 years ago. So, people should be aware that about close to 100% of the time, an abuser, regardless of his history of violence towards the mother, is going to end up with unsupervised contact with those kids under court order. In a small percentage of cases, I don't know how many, but it looks quite small. There's no research on this, but it's a pretty small percentage in my experience. He will have some period of his visits being supervised. Typically in the sort of 3 to 6 month range. I've almost never seen it go more than a year. Again, just a handful of cases where I've ever seen it go more than a year. But most guys are going to get unsupervised contact by court order immediately. And even when you get a 3 or 6 or 12 month delay, how much does that really help? And then the court is going to start using this language about, well, it's time for us to normalize the kid's relationship with him. Don't ask me why. This relationship should be normalized. It's like, oh, well, your dad beats women, but we think you should have a standard, same kind of relationship with him that children would have with any other non-custodial parent. If they knew a bunch of other things about the parent, male or female, the person was a drug dealer, the person was a very serious alcoholic, the person had a long history of committing crimes, whatever it may be, they don't say, yeah, but we want to move towards normalization. But as soon as it's a father who's had a history of violence and all kinds of other abuse towards the mom, we want to move towards normalization. So what this means is that when we tell a woman you should leave the children's father for the good of the children, what we are in effect saying to her is, you should take steps in your life that are going to lead your children to be spending far more time alone with him than they are spending now. Huh. Are we sure that that's what we want to say? Are we sure that she's an irresponsible mother who's guilty of failure to protect because of her reluctance to take that step? She knows what this guy is like. She knows what he's capable of. She's now going to handle things in a way where then she's not going to be able to keep an eye anymore even on what's happening. It's going to be hard for her to even support her children emotionally after bad events because she won't even know what bad events have happened and when. And it's very hard to get kids to talk about what's happened during their unsupervised contact with batterers. They tend to come home very closed-mouthed. So her ability to be a resource for them drops dramatically. So she's being called guilty of failure to protect for staying when she's in a much better position to protect when she stays. Now, I'm not saying that women should be pressured to stay either. What I'm saying is she has to figure out, based on her particular abuser, based on her kids' ages and a bunch of things about what her kids are like and how much, for example, they would be able to reliably tell her what had happened. She has to know things about her local supports, her local court system, a whole bunch of things that she has to know to figure out whether to leave, and if she is going to leave, when and how to do it. And we've just got to let go of the idea that that's the answer. And since there's a lot of advocates here, I want to mention that there's a free guide now, and it's long. It's like 40 pages or something that you can get online, written by Jill Davies, who's been great in this field for decades, called Advocacy Beyond Leaving. I think it's from Futures Without Violence, but in any event, you can just find it by the title. Is it Futures Without Violence? Advocacy Beyond Leaving. And it's specifically a guide for how to think about being there for an abused woman without putting your focus on how do I get her to get out of this relationship. And the other thing I like to say to advocates is that, and this, I say this to when I'm training child welfare folks either. The day before yesterday, I had a bunch of child welfare folks down in Oklahoma City. If you set the measure of your work as, did I succeed in getting her to leave the abuser, you're going to chronically feel like you're not accomplishing anything because she's typically not going to be able to leave the abuser for quite a while. The statistics tell us that abused women do eventually, overwhelmingly, get out of the relationship, but it takes a long time, longer than you're going to be involved in the case most of the time. And so you're going to feel like, oh, my work was a waste. I accomplished nothing. And it's not true. You've accomplished typically so much more than you have any idea that you've accomplished. It's a matter of using the wrong measurement. What you want to measure is, have I increased this woman's ability to know what her rights are and fight for them? In other words, have I increased her sense of agency? And when she has children, then you want to think in terms of, have I left her in a better position to be able to fight for those kids than she was in when I arrived? And what I say to child welfare folks is, if you have spent the time criticizing her, the 6 months or 2 years or whatever of your relationship with her, you've spent the time criticizing her, warning her that if she doesn't do this and this and this, she's going to lose her children, you've actually left her less prepared because she's more mistrustful of people, she's more withdrawn, and actually you've pushed her towards the abuser. Because when outsiders come on that kind of way, that's who she's going to tend to bond with. And whereas if we have left her knowing a lot more about what resources are out there, having helped her learn some skills for how to draw in those resources, if we've built up her sense of self, if we've talked to her a bunch about her rights and made her feel like a more valuable person, and we've treated her as if we think she's a more valuable person, if we've helped her learn a bunch of things about her kids' needs and how she might help those kids, but again, in a respectful way, be careful when you're a 20-year-old worker and she's a 40-year-old mom to not talk condescendingly to her about what her children's needs are, and you haven't raised children and she's raised 5 or whatever. But if when that conversation can be had respectfully, she's usually very eager for information about how any parent is very eager for information. I've been down this road. You want help from anybody usually if you're a parent, as long as it's kind, respectful help, and the people are willing to share their ideas, and don't get too critical. Because no parent, even apart from this context, loves a lot of criticism. So those are just some underlying frames, both in thinking about the abuser and then in thinking about his impact on women and kids, that I would love for you to hold during the day. Oh, I think I left my clicker right here. Okay, so I'm going to do what's always the scariest part of the day for people, which is I'm going to do a definition of a domestic violence offender. And the reason this is scary for people is they think, oh my God, Lundy's going to give us domestic violence 101, and like we've heard it 16 times by now. It's not that. The reason I do the definition is because all day long I'm talking about abusers and batterers, and I'm using those two terms interchangeably. I tend to be moving more these days towards saying abuser rather than batterer, just because of how people react to the word batterer. I still in many ways believe in using the word batterer with the client, by the way, but we can get into that discussion another time. But publicly, I tend to move more towards abuser. So I want to be clear about who I'm talking about. So I'm talking about someone who is using a pattern of bullying behaviors. It's built into life in a bunch of different ways. And the day-to-day flavor may be primarily about verbal abuse and just put-downs and demeaning and degrading, and that stuff takes a huge toll over time. Please don't underestimate what the impact is of those kind of behaviors when you're subjected to them over and over and over again, particularly by somebody that you cared about, or at least used to really care about, and who claimed to really care about you. It may be primarily about economic abuse, and abused women get ripped off constantly in so many ways economically by the abuser. It may be very heavily about various kinds of sexual mistreatment, some of which can be subtle and hard to put your finger on, but are really damaging. And so that what we tend to define as physical violence, the outright assaults or the outright sexual assault, that's really the tip of the iceberg. And this image that I sort of had of when I came into the field of the domestic abuser, kind of like getting his paycheck every Friday and getting drunk and terrifying people in the home, that's not the normal style. That guy does exist, But that's not the normal style. What the research tells us is that the average number of assaults, actual physical assaults, by the domestic abuser per year, 2.5. So we have to let go of the sort of every Friday image. And that assaulting her, twice a year or once every 2 years is enough to keep her quite intimidated and is enough to keep the children really intimidated. And then all he has to do from then on is what we call wave the flag. And that can be a certain way that he walks towards people with a scary look on his face. When you talk to abused women, you hear a lot about the look. He had the look, he got the look. She knows what it means, he knows what it means. It means watch out, you could get hurt, physically hurt. So one of the questions that arises sometimes is, well, how do you define a man as a batterer? When has it crossed the line into physical violence? Well, any degree of sexual assault or sexual coercion, to me, has crossed the line into physical battering. And some sexual assaults a lot of sexual assaults don't look like what you would think of as physical violence. He wasn't punching her or slapping her while he was raping her. He was doing things like not letting her sleep all night. And it's hours and hours. And this woman, unfortunately, when she says what's happened to her, tends to say, so I gave in and let him. And I always say to her, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. If you gave up in exhaustion fighting him after 3 or 4 hours, that doesn't mean you let him do it. And try to be there for her about that, because she doesn't deserve to be putting that on herself at all. But then any other way that he sends a message, I have the potential to hurt you physically, he has crossed the line to me, and I would now define him as a batterer, not as a pure psychological abuser. If he raises a fist, he's a batterer. If he says, you're going to be sorry, you don't want to find out what I'm capable of, he's a batterer. If he locks her in a room, he's a batterer. Those are all either taking power over her body or actually assaulting her body, or letting her know that he might, that she needs. He has various ways of giving her the message, don't forget that I could. And some guys never have to do it. Some guys, that's intimidating enough that he never has to do it. That's battering. Does the pure psychological abuser exist? Yes, we don't have statistics on it, but I have just run into it professionally. The guy where when I talk to the woman in a confidential conversation where he's not going to know about it, she still says, and she says he's awful, she still says, no, there's no element of my being afraid that he's going to hurt me. But it's really not common. It's really not common. In fact, even some of those cases, a few of those cases that I've been involved in, it later turned out that he was physically violent. It just had to do with our societal sense that it's not violence until he's punched you in the face with a closed fist or whatever. But eventually she was saying, well, yeah, he had done this and this. And I said, well, that's an assault or a very explicit threat. So then the other thing that I like to emphasize about that isn't really, well, it grows out of this definition, is that when we're trying to help women process what has happened to them, very often some of the deepest things that they're carrying, some of the deepest wounds that they're carrying, are about the various forms of sexual mistreatment by the abuser. And it often will seem like she's reluctant to talk about it, but she's not. She thinks you can't hear it. If she thinks you can handle hearing it, she is eager to talk about it. And so I think it's important for us to start to notice our own reactions, because when a woman says, my husband or my boyfriend hit me, we start to ask a bunch of questions. Well, what was the assault like? What did he actually do? What was the nature of the violence? And how were you hurt by it? What happened beforehand? What happened afterwards? Where were the children during this? When a woman reports having been sexually assaulted, there's a real tendency to leave it there and say, oh, I'm really sorry, that's awful, and put down the note, but not do that. Oh, describe the assault if you want to, but she usually does. What happened before? What happened after? What kind of excuses did he make? How did he blame it on you? Where were the kids? We've got research telling us that kids witness just as high a percentage of the sexual assaults as they do of the physical assaults that happen to mothers in their home. And that one was a surprise to me. There's something about hearing about sexual assault where you just assume right away that it's a somewhat more private matter. But it's not true. And once I saw the research, I started to think it through, and I started to think, yeah, exactly how would kids not be aware of that? Just like we say, well, how would they not be aware of the physical violence? But then it came into my personal life because one of my really good friends, someone who's one of my good friends to this day, but this was some 15 years ago or longer, started talking to me about the fact that he and his sister had grown up having to repeatedly hear their stepfather raping their mother. So it brought it home in a very powerful way to me. I came into the field a little more than 30 years ago, which is remarkable since I'm only 45. At that time, I think we could reasonably say the domestic abuser is a bit of a mystery. Like, we don't really know who he is. We don't really entirely know what's driving him. Although by the time I came to Emerge, the people who were running Emerge, because it had already been there for close to 10 years by the time I got there, they had actually really figured out a tremendous amount. But it was not widely known. The studies were just beginning. There were only a few studies. This is not true in our time. In our time, we know what these guys are about. We have a very substantial body of research into them, and they're not a mystery anymore. The term coercive control means different things to different people, but to me, what coercive control means is it's a kind of control where when you resist that control, it gets worse rather than better. So when you stand up to the domestic abuser, when his partner stands up to him or his former partner stands up to him, he will take steps to hurt her more. And typically when she resists him, so if she says, hey, stop telling me how to make spaghetti, I know how to make spaghetti, he's not like, oh, sorry. Which is how we hope, say, your compulsively controlling cousin might respond when you tell him not to tell you how to cook spaghetti. But it's not how the abuser is going to respond. The abuser retaliates. And he generally retaliates double. So if she says, stop controlling me, leave me alone, don't tell me who my friends can be, whatever it is she's trying to stop his control about, he's going to get her right away. He's going to hurt her. And I don't mean physically, although it might be physical, but it usually won't be. But he's going to make her feel really bad with insults and demeaning, whatever it is. But then he's going to get her a second way, which is that whatever she complained about, he's going to make a point of increasing how much he does that. So when she raises a grievance, her experience is going to be, A, I get hurt, B, it doesn't accomplish anything except, if anything, bring it more into my life. And I like to underline this for people because when people come into a case that's been going on for 5 years or 20 years, it's been going on for a long time already, you're often going to find a woman who's not fighting back that often. She still fights back sometimes. You may not see it, but you almost never see cases, they're really rare, where she's just given up all efforts to fight back. But some systems and some friends and relatives misread this and start saying, oh, the problem here is that she doesn't stand up for herself. And they'll say things to her like, don't let him treat you that way, I would never put up with that. Sometimes her own kids, like her teen kids, teen daughters in particular, will start to say, why do you let him treat you that way? That's a misunderstanding of what she's up against and confusing coercive control with annoying control with the annoying cousin. And she's tried. She's tried in so many different ways for so many years, and most of it has not gone well. So once in a while, standing up for herself actually led to some improvement in something. And that's another one of the places, by the way, and I'll mention a few of these over the course of the day, where we have to be careful about not, how to say this. On the one hand, we don't want to in any way minimize the destructiveness of the domestic batterer. On the other hand, we don't want to start to cast him as some kind of monster, although he gets monstrous. But if you cast him as some kind of monster, that actually ends up working to his advantage, because you start thinking, well, she's still allowed to go out to her whatever it is, her roller skating club every Thursday. You know, how could she be that badly abused if he still lets her go out to her roller skating club every Thursday? That's because of having this kind of stereotypical or monstrous view of the abuser. The nuanced view, I had a very direct experience of this because I was doing expert testimony on a case that was out of Hawaii. And at some point in the marriage, they had moved from one of the islands to one of the other islands because it was what she wanted to do. And so while I was on the stand, the abuser's lawyer is saying to me, are you aware that, that they moved from, Kauai to Maui because it's what she wanted to do? And I said, yeah, that's my understanding of the history. Well, how could that be a domestic violence case? If they did that because it was what she wanted. So it's exaggerated. And it's not, it's exaggerated in a specific sense, because in some ways, some of the worst things they do, you couldn't really exaggerate. But I'm saying it's exaggerating the dynamics of that relationship. And it's suggesting that if a woman hasn't had 100% of her rights taken away from her, then she couldn't possibly have had 90% of her rights taken from her. It's like, so please don't tell abused women to stand up to him more, and please don't tell abused women to stand up to him less, because this is the other aspect of her experience, is that she gets told by people those two opposite messages, sometimes from the same people in her life. Sometimes the same people who are telling her, why do you take that from him, are on a different day saying, well, you really set him off. What I have increasingly come to say, this has become sort of one of my phrases in the last couple of years, is the abuser lives his script. He's going to live his script in a relationship. It doesn't matter who he's involved with. She could be a lovely person, or she could be someone that we all agree is a total pain in the butt. That's not going to change the trajectory of his abusiveness. It has nothing to do with her. And that means that she cannot change the trajectory of that abusiveness. It's not in her control. It's being nicer to him, finding out what's bothering him, getting him to get some emotional help, helping him with this, helping with that, building him up and telling him he's a good person, etc., will not change the trajectory of the abuse. And the opposite, like so-called putting her foot down, will not change the trajectory of the abuse. The level of abuse that an abuser uses, the level that he reaches in a relationship, is proportional to his level of investment in that relationship. And I refuse to use the word love. This ain't love, in my opinion, but that's why I call it investment. I don't even want to call it attachment, because a lot of abusers are not attached to the victim in any emotional sense. They're invested in a whole bunch of things that they're going to require her, that he's going to require her to do for him. To me, one of the essential frames for thinking about an abuser is that his problem is the beliefs that he was socialized into about what kinds of services he has the right to require women to do for him, and what kind of enforcement he's entitled to use when those requirements are not met. So it's about exploitativeness and enforcement. This has nothing to do with how strong his feelings are for the woman in an emotional sense. What it does mean is that the abuser can sometimes be, for a pretty extended period of time in a relationship, that's just sort of like a light, lighthearted kind of, something where he doesn't expect it to go on forever. And he won't necessarily show his true colors. He can also be on good behavior, even with someone he does have some fairly strong feelings for, if he's on a campaign. And what I mean by that is, he may be facing criminal charges from a past relationship, or he may be in a custody battle from a past relationship. And when he's got a reason to be pretty decent to the new partner, he can do that. And he can then parade her around town. And she'll be around telling everybody, oh, he's awesome, he's nothing like that, I can't believe that you-know-what is saying those kinds of things about him, because it's totally not true. So he'll use her for window dressing. He can do what's in his best interest to do. And he can pull it together when it's in his best interest to do it. They do it when cops show up at the door. They're suddenly all like sir and ma'am to the cops while she's bouncing off the walls because she's traumatized. And that's part of why untrained cops are so quick to decide that she's the one who's the problem there. He can hold it together for months or sometimes even a couple of years when he's got some other reason why he wants to do that. But in any relationship that he develops a serious investment in, he is going to follow his script. And we are of much greater assistance to her when we help her understand you cannot change his script. He is going to go the path he's going to go. And women really struggle with this. And women struggle with this years after they've gotten out of the relationship. There's years later, they're still sometimes saying to themselves, yeah, but if I hadn't done this and this and this, maybe he wouldn't have gotten that way, and still questioning herself whether she somehow set him off down this path. So that's a really important role for us to play, to say, what wasn't you? Wasn't you? I'll say just a couple things about fear, which I mean, the intimidation, the scary stuff is the most intuitively awful to people, so I don't feel like I have to say a lot about it. The point I most want to emphasize is that the research is quite clear that the impact on both a woman and on kids, if she has kids, accumulates over time. So if she's being put in fear over and over again over a period of years, that trauma is building up. It's getting greater. Always our number one priority is trying to figure out, is there anything we can do to lessen the level of danger in this situation? And often in the short term, there's not much we can do, but we just want that to be our first thing in our thinking, like, this guy gets scary. And a lot of people are concerned with the question of, is he likely to kill? And that's a very important question. But I also always like to emphasize to people, he can do unbelievable harm over the years without ever coming any close to anything like a homicide, because of how it builds up over time. And then abuse by its nature is isolating of a woman, and it's isolating of the kids if she has kids. Being traumatized, first of all, it's kind of inherently isolating in a society that doesn't really get trauma, but also because it sticks you with this incredibly embarrassing, or that's not even the right word, but this issue that you have a sense of shame about. It makes it very hard to tell anybody what's happened. Kids have a hard time talking about it, moms have a hard time talking about it. So that it's immediately isolating just to be abused. But a high percentage of abusers that also, more abusers than not, in my experience, also use deliberate isolation tactics. Damage her relationships with other people on purpose. Don't let her go certain places. Train her not to trust people, saying, oh, those people are out. Such a common line from abusers. Oh, you think those people are your friends? They're just using you. He's going to try all kinds of things to get her to not trust the world. Why? Because he doesn't want her to go for help, but also because he has a real zero-sum mentality. His whole mentality towards a relationship is, if she has other people that she cares about, if she has other things in life, passions, interests, involvements, that's less for him. He doesn't see it as like, oh, that brings more energy and stimulation to the relationship. That's not his mindset. His mindset is, your whole life should be oriented towards me, and in any way that it's not, that's my loss. And not only that, it's my unfair loss. You're being wrong to me if you've got other things in your life. When I was leading abuser groups, we always used to go up at some point and draw a compass on the board and north, and say, you want her to be a compass and you want to be north. It's like her life, no matter where she is, no matter what she's doing, no matter what time of day it is, she's always supposed to be focused on what he might need. And that's his expectation, and that's why he doesn't want her to have other things in her life. The number of stories that I have heard from women about having a successful small business that he managed to get her to give up. Oh, honey, we don't need this. I'm making enough money. This business, you're under stress. Just think how nice it would be not to be under the stress of this business. And, I want you to be able to focus more on our kids. And it's all out of his deep caring for her that he wants her to give up this business. But just other things. When for years, I don't do these anymore, but for more than a decade, I led once or twice a year weekend emotional healing retreats for abused women who weren't with the abuser anymore. This was Lundy leads a women's retreat. And the reason that I started those was because I realized how little is out there for women about dealing with the after effects of the abuse. It's like if she's gotten out of the relationship, people think, oh, you're good now. You're set, you got out. And we learned, I led those retreats with a number of different co-leaders over the years, and we learned so much about folks' experience and what some of the kind of most lasting effects were and what some of the ongoing challenges were. In the later years of doing this, we started to have close to half of the women in a say, a 22-person retreat being mistreated by the family courts, by the custody courts. It was incredible. And another thing that I saw in women who were having the hardest time healing, where she could be 5 years out of the relationship and was still feeling so bad, was a history of sexual assault. And so we started to be able to see a lot what were these lasting effects. And a lot of it was about the lasting damage to her relationships, that it took years for her to repair the wedges that he had driven between her and various other people, like things he had told them about her, things he had told her about them, and the whole way that he'd gotten her isolated and mistrusting the world. Now I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes about control in a completely different sense, which is his control over his own behavior. So abusers are very fond of claiming that they lose control. And I came into the field assuming that was true. They must lose control. And with rare exceptions, they don't. Occasionally, you will have an abuser who's got such serious mental health problems that he actually is genuinely out of control of certain behaviors. Well, he's still an abuser. Occasionally, you'll have a guy who's such a serious substance abuser that he was so drunk or drugged that he really did do something that he was not entirely in control of. Be cautious about even going there, because I have dealt with clients who were very drunk and still made all kinds of shrewd decisions. So even very drunk, don't just accept, oh, well, then he was out of control, because usually even then he wasn't. But what happens, what we notice is particularly in abuser groups, is that as you start to go over these stories in detail, you start to notice all the decisions that were made. So he'll say, okay, this is a story that I got a few times from clients. I was so drunk that I had no idea what I was doing. And so I'm asking, oh, so you got arrested that night? No. When the police came, I ran out the back door and I hid in the backyard, and then a little while later, I took off through the neighborhood, and they came and found me. I was arrested, 2 days later or whatever. Like, oh, so you were so drunk, you had no idea what you were doing, but as soon as the police were at the door, you were not confused about who they were or what they were there for. Oh, honey, did you call the police for something? You, were so drunk you could barely stand up, and yet you ran pretty well when it was time to run. Oh, this is probably the first client I ever had. We used to do a little individual work, which we gradually decided was a mistake. But one of the first clients I ever had when I was brand new to Batterer work, we used to see them individually for the first 5 times they came. And we decided not to handle things that way. We decided instead to break it up into 2 stages of group, where you're in one group for your first 8 weeks, and then you're in the second stage group the whole rest of the time that you're in the program. The reason you sort of want 2 phases with abusers is that there's certain basics you have to go over with everybody, like that your feelings don't justify your behavior and these kinds of things. And you don't want, with guys who've been in the group 10 months, to be doing the same thing every week. So we used to do it by having an individual stage and then a group stage that we gave up. But anyhow, this is a guy who was my first individual client, very drunk, had beaten the woman up badly, had tied her to a chair. He said he'd partially tied her. How do you partially? You're either tied her or not. Had ripped clothes off. This was all by his own admission. Had ripped clothes off of her. And I said, will you describe, just asked him to describe her injuries, and he told me about all these different welts and black and blues that she had on her arms and on her legs. And I said, what were her injuries to her face? And he looked at me like I was kind of young and naive, which I was. And he said, oh, I wasn't going to do anything that would show. And in that kind of tone, like, what's the matter with you? You think I'm stupid? I did an interview with her. We always did interviews with the victim, confidential interviews with the victim if we were able to reach her. And she confirmed that he was extremely drunk. So it's not that he was lying about how drunk he was. It's that he was lying about his helplessness in the in the situation. One of the techniques that we started to use is to ask the abuser why he hadn't done something even more serious. So if he's claiming to have lost control of himself, that's standard with them. Okay, so you admitted to me that you slapped her twice and you shoved her onto the floor. There she was on the floor. It would have been easy to kick her in the head, and forgive me for these examples. I know they're going to be disturbing to some people in the audience, but I really need to go through this stuff. It would have been easy to kick her in the head. Why didn't you? He will always tell you why. At least, I'm not saying in other contexts, but at least in the context of an abuser group, he always tells you why. He doesn't just say, dunno, I stopped, I don't know why I stopped. He'll tell you. He'll say, I didn't want to kill her. He'll say, the children were yelling, I suddenly realized they were in the room. Or he'll say, I was afraid somebody was going to call the police. He'll give you the reason. And the most common response that I got, as common as all the other ones put together, was, oh, I wouldn't do that. In addition to being the most common response, that's actually the most revealing response, because it tells you he does not do what he considers it unacceptable to do. So his problem is not his explosiveness. His problem is what he considers acceptable for a man to do for enforcement purposes in a relationship. That technique works well in a group because then you're able to say, look, see, you kept right on making choices about what was in your best interest or what you consider, ethically unacceptable. Oh, the other thing we see in abuser groups is that we'll see guys be quite disapproving of other guys who did things that they believe they wouldn't do. So they'll say things like, you went too far. In other words, yeah, it's abuse her a little, but just don't abuse her too much. Or they'll say things like that they believe he didn't have a good enough reason for what he ddid. Like there wasn't adequate provocation. I've had a number of clients over the years say to me, not tons, but I've had a few clients say to me over the years, well, I'm not one of those guys that comes home and beats his wife for no reason. So wherever you're at on the spectrum as an abuser, you're convinced that the real abusers are the ones who are farther up the line. When they first started telling me, when I was new in the program, these guys don't lose control of themselves, I thought, oh, that's the program's dogma. That's like a line, like people who have beliefs about the criminal personality or some of this kind of stuff. It's like their line. And it took me a while to realize, nope, this is the real on the ground. And I guess what I might conclude from that is that if you have someone who just randomly does some lousy thing, that maybe that could be a loss of control. But when you see this pattern, like, how is that going to be related to a loss of control, of the tearing her down, the checking up on her, the monitoring her, the cutting off her relationships? It's like, next point I will say is that the abuser is a highly entitled individual with respect to partner relationship. One of the things that, again, took a while to crystallize for me is what an oddly specific problem domestic violence perpetration is. That his violence, in the great majority of cases, is targeted only towards partners and ex-partners, that people can be like a work colleague of this guy for a decade and would never have any idea that he had this kind of stuff going on. You could be on his softball team, whatever it is, you would not see. And so he's not someone who's necessarily going to come off in other contexts as an entitled, unreasonably demanding, everything should be done for me kind of person. Some abusers will, but just the same percentage that there is in the population at large of super entitled people. But with respect to partner relationship, his belief is that everything should be done for him on his terms. If he's not happy, you're not doing your job by definition. Because if you were doing your job, he'd be happy. On every front in his life, somehow you're responsible for it. Well, let's say that we could say, like, let's say we could draw a picture of people's body of rights. And we would say, this is a man's rights, and we would say this is women's rights, and I would hope they were the same size. And then these are children's rights, where they're a little smaller, but still really substantial. I believe they have a right, actually, for their opinions on decisions to carry substantial weight, but I don't believe they have the right to make those decisions. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say the circle's a little smaller, but still substantial. Well, what has happened in his mind is, first of all, his circle has just ballooned. So he's got rights in his mind to all kinds of things that he has no right to. And so when you're dealing with abusers, you're constantly up against him defining certain things that happened as denials of his rights that were in no sense denials of his rights. And I'm going to give you an example of this in a minute. Meanwhile, her rights have shrunk down to almost nothing. He really doesn't believe that there's anything she has rights to unless he grants those to her. But the concept of an inalienable right, a right that you cannot lose, does not exist for him with respect to a woman he's involved with or was ever involved with. Or for some abusers, it wouldn't apply to any woman he even once wished to be involved with. What happens with the children's rights is going to vary from abuser to abuser. They're always going to shrink somewhat. But sometimes they actually remain bigger than the woman's rights do in his eyes. And that, on top of everything else she's dealing with, makes her parenting life extraordinarily difficult because he's granting the children more rights than he's granting her. So one way of thinking about the project of working with abusers is to get him to shrink his sense of what his rights are down to their proper size. He will declare that you're taking his rights away from him because he's so used to it being like this. And to get him to expand the woman's rights and the children's rights out to their proper size. So, one of my fairly early clients, this wasn't way early, but I'd been, maybe 5 years or whatever in the field. By this time, I was not in the dark. We always required all of our clients, multiple times actually during the time in our program, to tell the story of their most severe incident of violence. And he was talking about a time when he was strangling the woman against the wall. He did not use the term strangling. No abuser ever used the term strangling. He said, I had her by the throat, as if it were just like a way of holding somebody. I had her by the throat. And then he says to the group, and she tried to kick me in the groin. And of course I lashed out. And she got this big gash down her cheek from my fingernails. What does she expect? Try to kick a guy there. And I'm not exaggerating. This was his tone. This was his sense of woundedness, that he was the wounded party while he talked about this. So this is important to unpack because he has captured not just how the abuser thinks about the physical abuse, but how the abuser thinks about all the verbal abuse. So first thing, she has zero right to self-defense in his eyes. I would hope that we could all agree that while someone is strangling you, if you have a chance to kick them between the legs, you have every right to do so. In fact, it would even be a recommended course of action. Certainly, if somebody were strangling me, I would not hesitate to do that. So consider yourselves on notice. To him, that's an outrage against him. And it shows how anti-male she is, that she would try to kick a guy where it counts. And that therefore that justified him slicing her across the face. So what he has done is exactly reverse aggression and self-defense. So that her acts of entirely legitimate self-defense are defined as aggression against him, and his acts of aggression against her are defined as efforts to defend himself. And that means that anytime we're hearing somebody who we know or strongly suspect is an abuser tell the story of anything that's happened in that home, from mundane things to severe things, we have to sort of put that through our mental filter. Like, I'm listening to a guy who turns everything backwards. I would argue, actually, that reversal is essential to the oppressive mentality. And I've written some about this, not a lot, about how the domestic violence home is really just a microcosm for any system of oppression. So when the owner of a sweatshop discovers that the workers are unionizing, usually he, is like, how can they do that to me? How can they be so ungrateful? I've been giving them work for years. I've been paying them money for years. And suddenly he, the owner, is the injured party of their efforts to unionize. It's the way the oppressive mentality works. Now, a high level of entitlement will lead to tremendous selfishness and self-centeredness. And so this is how the abuser works in a relationship. He's super generous a lot of times for quite a number of months early in the going, and then little by little, that just vanishes until everything is me. This, therefore, can easily start to look like personality disorder. And some of you may know about personality disorder. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this because some people won't even be interested in personality disorder, but the reason I like to spend some time on it is because it's become such a widespread belief that abusers are personality disordered. In fact, the term abuser is disappearing from the web to be replaced by narcissist. The great majority of abusers are not narcissists in a clinical sense. Their patterns can be so remarkably similar that in some ways I understand the confusion. What concerns me the most about this is that narcissism has very different roots from abusiveness. Narcissism has its roots in early and profound childhood wounds. Abusiveness has its roots in being trained by an oppressive society to think and behave oppressively. And if you turn all abusers into narcissists, what you've just done is completely let the community off the hook about having to look at any of the enabling of abusers, training of abusers, refusal to hold abusers accountable, the fact that prosecution to this day is still very reluctant to put any priority on these cases, completely ignore what's going on in the family law processes. He's a narcissist. Not only that, but if you're blaming the society, then you're talking about looking at a male-dominated society and the need to change that. If he's a narcissist, who's most likely to be blamed? His mother. And of course, you're going to have plenty of people who are so excited that we found a way to put the blame back on women. Now, you can have both of those things. You can be a societally produced abuser who's got a narcissistic personality disorder. You're a particularly intolerable client in an abuser program. We found that these guys were about 1 of 8, however, not like 6 of 8 or 7 of 8 in our group. They went nowhere. Actually, interestingly, they didn't always go nowhere. They went nowhere that lasted. Of course, most of our clients go nowhere that lasted, but you particularly notice, I always say that with abusers, you have a very small likelihood of change. With the narcissistic abuser, you have a 0 likelihood of change. And although to some extent you can, interestingly, with the narcissist, sometimes you can get improved behaviors today by just telling him what to do, and to some extent he will do what you told him to do. Don't ask me why. Maybe it's about that preoccupation with self-image, but if I tell him, I want you to go today and drop that retaliatory protective order that you took against her because she took one against you, so you went and took a retaliatory one against her. Sometimes he'll just go do it because we told him to do it. But it doesn't mean anything's really changing. I'd have to have him for the whole rest of his life and tell him every day what to do. One practical issue with this is that you will sometimes talk to women who are with a woman who's very concerned with the question of whether he's a narcissist or not. And what I say to the woman is, don't put much energy into trying to figure that out, because if you come to the conclusion that he is a narcissist, that doesn't change your toolbox in any way from what it is right now not knowing that. It doesn't suddenly open up avenues. Oh, well, if it turns out he's a narcissist, then I know this. Personality disorder is known to be completely unresponsive to therapy, no fault of the therapist. And so if you figured out, oh, he's a narcissistic abuser, all you know is that the picture's even worse than you thought before. So encourage her not to put much energy in that direction. It's not going to shed any useful light on anything. It is helpful for the abuser program to figure it out because it does end up having some impact on certain ways we have to deal with him. But it's not useful information really for her. Like abusers, narcissists can sometimes cover the problem for a pretty long time and can seem very generous and attentive. Narcissists are sometimes some of the people who can really make you feel cared about for a while. And you don't really know until you're in some substantial conflict with them, and particularly when you try to raise grievances with them about their own conduct. But what I find with narcissists is that it may take a while, but other people in his or her life start to notice the problem. Not as fast as you wish they would, but other people do start to notice the problem. Whereas with the abuser, it can be hidden forever, except from people who are involved with them. Okay, so I already talked about the ways that he comes out feeling like the victim, believing because of this way that he's doing this reversal. Yeah, there are also abusers who don't really see themselves as a victim, but will still get really into playing up that part in a strategic sense. Okay, next. Because they're not out of control, they can cultivate a good public image. And so most abusers are quite well thought of in their neighborhoods, in their communities. It's not always true. Sometimes everybody knows. By the way, the style of abuser who's aggressive all over the place and who a lot of people are scared of him, and he's involved in what we call, in the field, we call generalized violence, he is an even greater risk to kill the woman than other abusers are. So if you know that he has generalized violence issues, that you need to be aware of that, because that's an additional risk factor, and it's only quite a small percentage of batterers that have generalized violence issues. Generally, he looks good in public. I think oppressors in general, oppressive people and groups and forces in general, don't try to maintain oppression through constant intimidation. A, it's too much work, it's too expensive. B, eventually it helps people see how the system is oppressive. So there tends to be this real back and forth in any oppressive system between outright intimidation and all kinds of lies, manipulations. Oh, we're going to give you, the powerful country, for example, is often giving $5 in aid through the front door, so you won't notice the $100 in resources that are going out the back door of your country. And we're here to help you. We're going to bring you democracy. A lot of his energy typically goes into being manipulative. And the more education he has, the sort of higher he goes up the socioeconomic scale, typically the better he's going to be at it. And I find a particularly hard one to help people heal from, to help moms and kids heal from, is all the manipulation. It's harder to even put your finger on what happened. You'll hear women a fair bit saying, I came out of an argument with him feeling terrible, but I can't even really explain why I came out of that argument feeling so bad. Like she can't even entirely identify what just got pulled on her. So we just want to try to be helpful to people and validate that and try to help them break down. Manipulativeness is just hard to analyze. By the way, it's a slippery subject carried out by slippery people. There's a wonderful children's book for helping children identify and articulate manipulation. So for kids who have abusive dads or other powerful manipulators in their lives, this is a great resource, even for kids who are quite young. And it's called A Bargain for Francis. And it's by Russell Hoban. Some of the parents in the room will know the Francis book. She's a badger, and she's got the big white stripe down her head. And A Bargain for Francis is about this character, Badger, being manipulated by a friend into giving up her china tea set and trading it for her friend's plastic tea set. And her friend, Gloria, does all the classic manipulative tactics, like pretending that she's doing it because she thinks it would be better for Francis, right? That's like a classic manipulative thing. No, you'd be happier with the plastic one. You don't have to worry about it breaking. And just maneuvers like that. And I don't remember all the other tactics she uses, but she uses like 5 or 6 classic manipulative tactics to get Francis to agree to this exchange that's really bad for Francis and really good for Gloria. And so it creates a wonderful context for conversations with kids down as young as, I would say, maybe even 3 years old, but certainly a 4 or 5-year-old is capable of figuring out what's going on in the story, and you can talk to them about it. You really have to avoid with kids saying anything bad about their father. If the abuser is their stepdad or just like a live-in boyfriend, then they're much less defensive about it. Like then you can sometimes speak fairly openly, critically of him, and they'll be right there with you. When he's dad, they don't want to hear bad stuff about him. Even they may hate him themselves and not want you to say bad things about him because he's their father. So we have to look for ways with kids to help them develop an analysis of what's going on without using him as an example, and then trust them that they will apply it to him. And I relate to my own childhood about this because I had plenty of criticisms of my parents, but I didn't like anybody else criticizing my parents. So it's much better for kids when we can teach them concepts. I think media literacy, for example, is really useful for children of battered women because learning how to think critically about advertising helps you learn how to think critically about manipulation. Because advertising, with all due respect to anyone here whose relatives work in advertising is manipulation. That's what it is. We're pretending that we're selling this to you because it would be good for you, when the real reason is it would be good for us. And so if kids get good at reading advertising, that's going to help them read their father better and other manipulators in their life. So by working with kids with a book like A Bargain for Francis, that we're not saying a bad word. about dad, but we're equipping them. I'll be talking a bunch of things about kids this afternoon. There's so much that weighs on them. I mean, we will talk about a bunch of different things that weigh on them when they're in a home where their dad or stepdad's abusing their mom. But I believe even amongst all this other stuff that they have to struggle with and that are wounded by, there's two things in particular that rise even above the rest of it all. One is fear, right? Basic questions about safety. Is somebody going to get hurt? And they mostly are worried about mom. And one of the great myths about kids is that kids are inherently self-centered. I hear people say this as a fact all the time. Well, kids are inherently self-centered, and they think the whole world revolves around them, that they're the center of the universe. I think those people are talking about certain adults. This is not true about kids in any inherent sense. Kids are very concerned with what's happening to others, and they're very concerned with what's happening to animals. Part of why I underline this point is that in a domestic violence divorce, where the abuser has not been that bad to the kids directly, the abuse has been mostly targeted towards mom, the family court becomes intensely suspicious of why the children are so bitter towards the abuser. The family court will start to say, believing this myth about kids' self-centeredness, well, kids wouldn't be that bitter towards her because of what happened to her. If he hasn't been doing anything to them, why are they so bitter towards her? She must be somehow getting them feeling bad, or she must be talking to them inappropriately, or somehow making them feel bad for her. It must be coming from her. This is just such a vast denial of children's experience. What's most painful to them about what's happening to mom is what's happening to mom. Wonderful book. Unfortunately, this is again in the expensive category because it's a text/professional book. Is a book by Carolyn McGee called Childhood Experiences of Domestic Violence. And it's really the best book I ever read on the subject of children's exposure. I used to say, like a lot of people in the field, that when children were invested in protecting their mothers, that we needed to relieve that burden for them by telling them, you can't protect your mom, kids don't protect adults, adults protect themselves, and adults protect each other, but kids can't protect adults. So then Carolyn McGee's book is a remarkable set of interviews. She did interviews with 50 moms and with 50 of those moms' kids. So the kids are the same kids of the moms. And then it's such a readable book. For a professional book, it's a very readable book. And on almost every page, she includes one or two or three quotations from the moms or the kids. Well, the kids over and over again, interestingly enough, were saying to her, we're sick of people telling us not to protect our moms. I was like, oops. And this book is from England, where I think some certain social service things are much stronger than in the United States. So the message to tell kids, don't protect your mom, was wider spread there, which in this particular instance was not a good thing. And they said to her, we want to know better ways to protect our moms. And so it finally sank into me that telling kids you can't protect your mom does not relieve the burden in any way. And what I finally came to accept was we can't relieve the burden. We don't have that in our power. We can make the burden more tolerable, or we can make it less tolerable, but we cannot remove it unless this family gets safe and the abuse stops. And telling them you can't protect your mom does not make the burden more tolerable. It makes it less tolerable. So that's an example of the kind of thing that changes when you start to really hear the children's perspective in the way that Carolyn McGee does. Children are very worried for mom. They're very worried for their siblings, particularly younger siblings or any sibling that they perceive as vulnerable. Like if they have a sibling that's really unpopular, or they have a sibling that's got chronic health problems or anything like that, they worry. But if there's like a baby or toddler in the house, they worry a lot about that kid. It's a real load. And they worry for themselves. And again, a line you'll hear sometimes, and I've heard this sometimes in family law proceedings, but also in other contexts sometimes. Well, yes, he's hurt their mom, but the children know he would never hurt them. That's just totally false. What was her name? Betsy Groves. demonstrated years ago that if kids witness stranger assault on the street, they worry that the assailant may sometime find them and hurt them. People they've never seen before and have no reason to believe they'll see again. So if children witnessing a complete stranger assault on the street worry that that assailant is going to find them and hurt them sometime, how are they not going to worry about that happening right under their own roof? It's absurd. So yes, of course, they worry that it might happen to them too. My point is just that that's not usually their primary concern unless he has already started to target that child. Okay, last thing I'll say from this slide is it takes a long time to produce an abuser. 15, 20, 25 years of socialization. I can talk to you some about sort of what that involves and how so many men manage to not go down that path. Because when people say they wonder what produces an abuser, I look at the society and I think the harder thing to explain is how so many men are not abusers when you start to see what the societal messages are like out there and how pervasive they are. And because a majority of men, according to the research, do not abuse women. There's this expectation in various contexts that somehow, or this belief that somehow he might have just gotten over this. It's like he might have woken up one morning and realized he didn't want to be that way anymore. It's like, you're not going to spend 15, 20, 25 years producing somebody with a deep set of beliefs and a deep set of patterns and have it just go away one day. It does not just go away. Abusers who change from a very difficult, uncomfortable process that takes years of work. Fortunately, there are some who decide to do the work. There's not a ton. I believe, actually, that the vast majority of abusers could change. It's not that they can't change, it's they're not willing to do the work. They're too selfish. It's really, really hard work over a long period of time that involves facing up to a lot of stuff you don't want to face up to because it makes you feel guilty. And because it makes you have to give up your privileges. And they're used to this, they're used to such an unfair relationship that they're not even comfortable with the image of what a relationship would be like if it were actually on equal terms. It's just important not to underestimate the depth of the problem. I am a deep believer in human beings. I will always believe there's a human being in there somewhere, but let's also be in reality about how deeply that person is buried. It's not like, oh, and there's a human being just right below the surface. It's like, no, it's down there. It's down there. And not get magical about change.